So I say it about 1,000 million times. There are huge numbers of ethical professionals working in the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm kind of assuming that that is you today. And what I'm going to talk about are the problems around missing trial results, problems which have been missed not just by industry, but also by policymakers, by academics, by medics, by regulators, and have really only begun to catch wind over the course of the last couple of years. And there are changes that are coming that will affect you, but there are also ethical issues that you are participants in and things that you could do to make the world better. So what I'm going to hammer through very quickly is firstly why withheld or missing trial results matter, why they matter at phase 1 and phase 2, as well as obviously phase 3 and phase 4. Then I'm going to talk about the campaign for better access to clinical trial results, summary results, and also individual patient data, and some of the changes which I'm sure you've all heard of. And then I'll also talk a little about the kickback against that campaign. And it is for you to decide whether you find that a stylish example of good behavior by your own industry, or whether you think you could do better. So some of you work on phase 1 trials. I'm only showing you this because I think it's a really interesting sort of cultural curio. It's easy to sort of imagine that phase 1 trials are conducted in glass and metal structures by people wearing white coats, but there is a reality, not just to phase 1 trials, to all trials, of real human beings participating in them. And in America, there's a whole scene of people who are full-time trial participants. This is how they make their living, participating in phase 1 trials. And this is their in-house magazine, Guinea Pig Zero. They describe it as the in-house journal of our bleeding, pissing work. And they have histories of guinea pigging, as they call it. They have site reports for different places. They give them marks out of 10. And they have descriptions of what it's like being in a trial that read like something from Hunter S. Thompson. The drugs are hitting the boys harder than the girls. The ephedrine's not so bad. It's like over-the-counter speed. I don't know why I did a Welsh accent there. And so, phase 1 trial participants are real people. This is a real person. He was a participant in the TGN 1412 trial. Legendary, actually a very foolish trial for a number of reasons. There were lots of reasons why we would have thought that this was a risky trial to do. It was an entirely novel biologic with a completely unpredictable mode of action, so there were lots of reasons for thinking it was risky. But in the event, as I'm sure you know, 8 young men took this drug and took this biologic and became very unwell. They ended up on ITU. These are the pictures from the BBC at the time. There were fingers and toes falling off. Absolutely horrific, horrific, horrific stuff. The official UK government inquiry into this episode made 2 observations and 2 recommendations. The first observation and recommendation was, if you're going to give an entirely novel biologic with unpredictable mode of action to 8 people for the first time ever, don't give it to them all at once, okay? Stagger it, maybe every 6 hours, every 12. I wouldn't want to go first, but I have a different relationship to risk to people who participate in phase 1 trials, and I'm very glad that there are people who do that, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude. The second observation and recommendation that they made has not been implemented, because they said, actually, this was a little more foreseeable than we thought. I mean, we know that this was a risky compound to start with, but actually it was even more foreseeable than that, because somebody had been given a similar biologic with a similar mode of action several years previously. It had had similar adverse effects, and nobody knew about it, because it hadn't been written up, because there is no culture of disseminating the results of phase 1 trials, whether in published academic journals or through some other database that can be shared, perhaps even behind closed doors. And they recommended that phase 1 trials are made more widely available, and that has been ignored to this day. Only 1 in 10 phase 1 trials report their results within a year, 1 in 5 within 5 years. Moving on to phase 2 trials, this is a molecule called lorcainide. This is a class 1C antiarrhythmic drug, and it never got licensed for the treatment of premature ventricular complexes. However, other drugs from the same class were, and they were used very widely throughout the 1980s. We relied on surrogate outcomes, and I'm sure people in this room don't need to be told how risky that can be. So we knew that they were pretty good at reducing the number of abnormal heart rhythms that people had, and we assumed that would translate into a benefit on mortality. In actual fact, when the CAST trial was finally conducted and completed, reported its results in the early 1990s, we discovered that although these drugs were very good at reducing the number of abnormal heart rhythms people had, they actually increased your chances of dying. Some people have estimated that the number of people who died as a result of this prescribing practice are upwards of 100,000. In the American literature, that's described as more people than died in the whole of the Vietnam War. That's only true if you count deaths on the American side of the Vietnam War. It's just an interesting example of unconscious imperialism in the academic literature. Now, to what extent was this foreseeable? Well, Phase 2 trials, traditionally, especially for drugs which don't come to market, don't get published, and that was the case here. Lorcainide was trialled in 1980 by a group led by A.J. Cowley, and they found that this drug increased the chances of dying. Many of you are statisticians, you'll be interested to know, he says, when we carried out our study in 1980, we thought the increased death rate that occurred in the Lorcainide group was an effect of chance. 100 people randomized, 2 groups of 50. There were 8 deaths on Lorcainide and none on placebo. I don't expect you to do any precise p-value in your head, but I don't think I'm buying that that was an effect of chance. But anyway, the development of Lorcainide was abandoned for commercial reasons, a familiar story, and of course it was. And this study was therefore never published. It's now a good example of publication bias. The results described here might have provided an early warning of trouble ahead. Now this is an editorial from 1993, just after the CAST trial has published its findings, just after we discovered that this highly prevalent prescribing practice for a decade was incredibly dangerous. And he says here, the results described here may have provided an early warning of trouble ahead. That wins some kind of award, I think, for understatement when we are talking about death on a biblical scale. And it's incredibly important to realize that in medicine, you know, it's very eye-catching. If there's a crap surgeon who kills people, or a dirty ward where we can see the dirt that kills people, then it's really easy to see that that's bad. It makes a very easy story. But a complex statistical problem or a difficulty with a mismatch between surrogate outcomes and real-world outcomes and stuff like that, it's actually more difficult to get a grip on, to get an intuitive feel in your belly. You can't name the people who died so easily. You can't put their pictures on the front covers of newspapers. But actually, when we distort the clinical evidence that's collected on a small number of people, and that is then applied to a very large population, like, for example, the population of a country, then we can scale up the harms and cause harm on a biblical scale. So, most importantly, phase 3 and 4 trials, the trials that we use to make treatment decisions on a daily basis. Now, in the 1980s, and probably not much later, maybe the 1990s, we lived in this rather slapdash world where we said, hey, look, here's a trial that has a positive result. In fact, here are 2 trials with positive results, and I'm happy. That means I'm going to use this drug because it's obviously great. Now we know that that's not acceptable. We add all of the results of all of the trials that have ever been done on one treatment together in order to find out which treatment is best. It is extraordinary when you tell the public that this is a new idea, that the Cochrane collaboration was founded in 1990, that before the late 80s we didn't do systematic reviews, we just wrote haphazard book chapters and review articles based on, oh, I think I heard of that trial and my friend did that one, and I'll keep my ears open at conferences and take a few notes, and I'll tear out the trials that I look relevant to my review when in the journals that happen to come to me in my office. That kind of haphazard approach, similar to like a 15-year-old writing a school essay, that then produced these book chapters and review articles that were canonical. When you tell the public that that's how we used to do evidence-based medicine, they are amazed and appalled. So we now live, quite rightly, in the era of systematic reviews. But systematic reviews go wrong if we don't have all of the trials. Of course they do, and of course you understand that. Now, unfortunately, we know that trial results are routinely withheld from doctors and researchers, the people who need that information in order to make informed decisions about which treatment is best. And I'm going to tell you, firstly, a story, and then one prevalence study, and then I'm going to tell you about reviews of all the prevalence studies that have been done on this problem. So this is a drug called reboxetine. It's an antidepressant, which I myself have prescribed. I prescribed it to somebody who hadn't done well on another class of antidepressants, so it made sense to try this one. And I'm a reasonably dorky doctor, so I read some of the literature. I hadn't done a full systematic review, but I'd seen a couple of trials showing it was better than placebo, a couple of trials showing it was just as good as any other antidepressant, and Lord knows they're not so fantastic, but if it's as good as them, then I'm happy to give it a go. Prescribed it happily. Then, in 2010, an extraordinary review was published by Goldacre et al. In the BMJ. IQWiG, the German equivalent of NICE, only more muscular. I don't know why people smile when you say that. IQWiG, the German equivalent of NICE, but more muscular, said to Pfizer, look, we're not willing to even consider reimbursing for this unless you give us all of the results of all of the trials that have been done, and we're going to put them all in the public domain. There was a huge battle, went on for a couple of years. Finally, they got all of the information, and when they added it all up, what they found was that reboxetine performed no better overall than placebo. And crucially, they found that there were 3 studies that had been done showing reboxetine was better than placebo. All of those had been published, but there were half a dozen studies done showing that reboxetine was no better than placebo, and none of those had been published. They found that there were 2 trials published showing that reboxetine was just as good as any other antidepressant, but data collected in 3 times as many patients showing that reboxetine was worse than other antidepressants, which was not published. Overall, when you added it up, you found an odds ratio of getting better on this stuff of about 1.01. If you squint, if you accept the addition of one trial with about 37 participants, where the odds ratio for getting better is about 8, so it's a massive outlier, you can just about persuade yourself this stuff is shavingly better than placebo. But the bottom line is, if I had seen all of the evidence, I, as a clinician, would not have prescribed this drug. Absolutely, unquestionably. So I was misled into prescribing a drug which overall did my patient harm. Not necessarily because this drug does more harm than good. If that is what we restrict ourselves to, if that's our aspiration in medicine, to give things which do at least no worse than nothing, no worse than being born into the Stone Age, then we're in a lot of trouble, right? The real problem is the opportunity cost. If there are 3 drugs in a class, then I want my patient, if they're all the same cost, to get the best. If I'm prescribing a drug which is ineffective, when I could have prescribed a drug that was effective, then I have been depriving my patient of an effective intervention because I was misled by treatment results being withheld, and that is plainly unacceptable. So, is this an anecdote? Well, the answer is no. There have been dozens of studies conducted where people grab all of the trials that have been conducted and completed and then follow them up to see if they have been disseminated, to see if they've been published. Now, there are lots of different ways of doing this. You can get all the trials that have been approved by an ethics committee and then go and see if they were published, all the trials on a register. If you're lucky and this country has a register at that time that covers those trials, then you can go and see if they've been published. Another way of doing it is you can go to the regulator and get all the trials which they hold. Now, that's exactly what this study was, and it's interesting because they were able to get all of the trials which have ever been conducted and submitted to the FDA pre-approval on all of the antidepressants over an 8-year period. Now, to be clear, this isn't all the trials that have ever been done on these drugs. In fact, probably nobody can give you that list. Nobody, amazingly, can give you a list of all the trials that have been done on these antidepressants, let alone all the drugs that are currently in use. But it is a representative sample of the drugs that were done before approval and given to the regulator. It was an enormous palaver to get hold of all of these, and it required somebody who knew the ins and outs of how the FDA works in order to go through all of the Freedom of Information Act requests that were necessary. Interestingly, it was led by a chap called Eric Turner, who was in fact previously the FDA reviewer working on reboxetine, and he became interested in this issue when he saw that reboxetine, which had been turned down by the FDA, was approved in Europe, and he was horrified to see that it was being used and realized that this was a product of publication bias. So, he got all the trials that the FDA had, divided them into all the positive ones, all the negative ones. He knows that that won't include trials done after the drugs came to market, trials in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, trials on anxiety or OCD or anything else, but he knows it's a representative sample. 38 positive results and 36 negative results out of the 74 trials he found in total. Then he goes to find all of the trials that the FDA has in the academic literature to see what doctors and researchers were able to see. And it's a very different picture, and it's a very different picture in 2 interesting ways. The thing that people notice first of all, of course, is that 36 negative results turn into 3 negative results. So almost all of the trials with negative results go missing in action. They are not published. What's more interesting, I think, is the 38 positive results turn into 48 positive results. Hallelujah! Where did this rabbit come from the hat? And as I'm sure you know, there are ways that you can buff, that you can polish, that you can spin a trial. And that's exactly what happened here, so people can play fast and loose with how they handle missing data, intention to treat analyses, switch their primary outcome to give them multiple chances of getting a positive finding, and that's how you go from 38 positive results to 48 positive results. So, is this a lone finding? Well, no. This is the NHS, NIHR, HTA review of all of the studies that have ever been done on publication bias. And when you add them all up, of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity here. There are lots of different types of study. But when you add them all up, overall, the chances of a trial being published after it's conducted and completed are pretty much 50-50. And the odds of a positive finding being published are about twice that of a negative finding. Now, it seems very clear to me that if half of all the trials that are being conducted and completed are not being published, that this is simply and unambiguously research misconduct. And when you explain this clearly to the public, they have no difficulty understanding that at all. I think there's been a very interesting cultural blind spot in medicine. I think we'd all agree that if you took all of the data points in one study and then deleted half of them in order to get the result that you wanted for that one study, that you would be guilty of research misconduct. Does anybody disagree with that? Just checking. Is anybody shy? Does everybody agree with that? Yeah, fine, good. That's slightly reassuring. So, interesting that we all accept that that is research misconduct because that would distort the apparent benefits of the trial. And yet, we seem to have no intuitive problem, historically, in medicine. We have no intuitive problem with withholding half of the results of the whole trials, half of the whole trials from the public record, even though we know full well that the very next thing that happens after a trial is conducted and completed is that all of the results are added together to get an overall omnibus sense of the risks and benefits of the treatment. So the impact of withholding half of the whole trials is exactly the same as deleting half of the data points from within one data set within one trial. And it is extraordinary, really, that this cultural blind spot has persisted, and it's extraordinary that there are still some people, I think, to be fair, many of them perhaps of an older generation, who just don't get that, who don't feel that in their belly. I have debated against senior people from industry who say, look, a lot of this sounds like sophistry to me. I've got 2 positive trials. That's enough to show the FDA that this drug works. So there are 7 negative ones. What are you worried about? There are 2 positive trials. And you go, wow, wow, okay? So the first thing that happens when you start talking about this problem is people jump up and they say, but this is a problem of the past. This has all been fixed. And there are 2 things which people cite as evidence that this has been fixed. Firstly, they claim that registration has been fixed, and secondly, they claim that dissemination has been fixed. The main thing that people cite when they claim incorrectly that registration has been fixed is the ICMJ guidelines from 2005, initially promised in 2003, 2004. And they say very clearly, we will not publish any trial that hasn't been properly registered on a WHO-recognized trial register. Interestingly, that doesn't include the European Union Clinical Trials Register, the contents of which, up until March of 2011, the contents of which were held entirely in secret, an extraordinary phenomenon that could only happen in Brussels, a transparency tool, a trials register, whose entire contents are kept secret. Absolutely extraordinary, and I think can only really reflect the leadership of Thomas Lundgren, and I think patients can be very glad that Guido Rassi has taken over because he seems to have a very different approach to protecting patients and transparency, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking that. I think Guido Rassi is an extraordinarily good thing at the European Medicines Agency. Now, ICMJ said, we're going to require that everybody posts their trials on a trials register before they begin. Everybody said, oh, that's great, then that's happened, that's fine, that's all been fixed. No routine public audit, and that is absolutely crucial and a problem we will see time and time again. Finally, when routine audits began to be conducted, we found that actually, when you take a sample of all of the trials published in ICMJ member journals or any set of journals in surgery or gastroenterology, and there have been about a dozen studies like this done now, we find that the prevalence of competent trial registration varies between about 2% and 70%. The biggest is published in New England Journal, about half a decade after these guidelines were passed and the whole problem was supposedly comprehensively fixed, found that half of all trials weren't registered properly and a quarter weren't registered at all, and that was in a sample of the top 10 journals from the big 5 fields of medicine, several years after this fix was allegedly implemented. So that has not happened. Secondly, people say clinicaltrials.gov. So the FDA Amendment Act 2007 requires that not all trials, but all trials with at least one site in the US or part of a marketing authorization for a currently marketed drug under MK801 and so on, but pretty much all trials on currently used medicines must post their results in summary form to clinicaltrials.gov within 12 months of completion. Completion is the last collection of the data point for the primary outcome. Now, again, everybody says, oh, this is all a thing of the past, everything's been fixed. Again, no routine public audit. And when one was finally conducted and completed, published in the BMJ just last year in 2012, and this is still the only public audit to have been published of this, where you can see the methods and results of the audit and the full data set, which can be downloaded. The full data set, you can go and look at every single trial and how they nominate it as being eligible or not eligible under the FDA Amendment Act. They found that the rate of compliance with this legislation overall was 22%. Now, there are 2 things which people from industry, I think, rather shamefully say to try and wriggle out of this finding. Firstly, they say, oh, well, that's not fair because actually the finding was 40% compliance for industry trials. Now, firstly, 40% is nothing to write home about, but secondly, 40% was actually mixed industry and academic trials. It wasn't industry trials. Secondly, sometimes people from industry say, oh, well, this is unfair because actually, look, there are some other audits that have been done which say that compliance is higher. It's about 50%. It's about 66%. Now, firstly, again, those compliance rates are nothing to write home about. Patients, policymakers are not impressed by those compliance figures. But secondly, all of these figures that are being thrown around by pharma, by the ABPI, who I think have actually behaved, I'm sorry to say, in a much more shameful fashion than FPA or Pharma over this issue. These figures that are being thrown around come from entirely unpublished audits. Slide shows, 5 slides on a PowerPoint presentation with no description of the methods. The idea that that is somehow better than a peer-reviewed journal article that actually shares its raw data is quite extraordinary. But in any case, even if we accept, for example, Stephen Whitehead's claim that the compliance here is 60%, 65%, that is still an appallingly low level of compliance. And crucially, the fact that there is any room for debate about compliance here demonstrates what a flawed piece of legislation this is. Clinicaltrials.gov very simply should have one single data field, which is this trial covered under FDA Amendment Act 2007, and what is the due date of the results? Because the problem is, at the moment, industry lobby and make special cases with very expensive teams of lawyers to say they're either exempt from reporting or that they should have a delay. And they have also lobbied to stop that being noted on the register. Now, this problem could be fixed entirely. We could automatically generate compliance reports from the data on clinicaltrials.gov, which is actually a very nice, very well-structured data set. You can download it yourself in XML. We could generate compliance figures instantly if clinicaltrials.gov was simply allowed to say, this is the due date for the results. And it's extraordinary that they've been prevented from doing so. But there's a much more important flaw in this legislation, which is that it's not retrospective. It doesn't go back before October 2007, and actually with the 12-month delay before October 2008. Now, you might say, why are we looking back to the trials of the past? Well, the answer is, we practice medicine today using treatments that came onto the market over the past 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. This is an early analysis, and it's not yet published, so close your eyes if that upsets you or freaks you out. But this is basically all of the prescriptions given in the UK in last year, looking at in what year were those drugs approved. And this gives you a clear sense, I think, of how little information we get for everyday prescribing if we only get a complete picture of the evidence going back to 2007. You can see that that gives us a complete picture of the evidence for about 5% of all prescribing decisions, because we prescribe drugs that came on the market in 1998, in 2003, in 2005. And that's why we need the trial results from those eras, not because we're trying to catch people out. I have no interest at all in catching people out. I have no interest at all in holding people to account for what they did. I just want a complete picture of the evidence so that we can make informed and safe prescribing decisions about which treatment is best today for the medicines that we use today. And that requires that we have the evidence that was collected on those drugs in the 21st century and in the 1990s. Unfortunately, the scale of the denialism, I mean, this really does baffle me, I can honestly say. This is an organization called the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences Group. This is a pair of documents they produced, co-signed by ABPI and Royal College of Physicians, were the co-chairs of the organisation that produced these documents, but co-signed by all of these organisations, although actually, to their credit, the Lancet and the BMA at least have now taken their names off them, because these documents contain a series of statements which are demonstrably factually untrue and give very dangerous false reassurance about the scale of the problem. The one on the left, for example, says information about industry-sponsored trials is publicly available. Well, that's simply not true. I mean, you can engage in sophistry and linguistic philosophy and say, oh, some information about industry-sponsored trials is available. That's obviously not the intent of that statement. And actually, they're even more clear. They say there is a robust regulatory framework governing disclosure of clinical trial information. No such robust regulatory framework exists. Today, even today, doctors, patients, researchers cannot get access to the results of the clinical trials for the medicines that we are prescribing right now. We've asked them, where is this robust regulatory framework? To what laws are you referring? No answer. The fact that it is impossible, they say, to get new medicines approved or data published in the top medical journals without prospective registration, prospective disclosure of clinical trial information on approved registries. Again, we know that that is untrue, not just from one study, but from about a dozen studies. Again, a group of medical students, the BMJ and I, have asked the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences Group, what is your evidence for this extraordinary assertion, which goes against all of the currently available evidence on whether or not this is true, and they have declined to answer. We asked them, how is it that all of these organisations, and these are robust, serious, big organisations with professional policy bodies, how did you come to sign up to a document that contains so many untrue statements about the state of play with respect to access to clinical trial results. And they've refused to answer. This is an absolutely extraordinary and I think very worrying thing. And this might be a detail to you, but when you talk to the general public about this problem, which I do, and which I feel I've had to do because we failed to fix this problem behind closed doors within the professions, when you talk about this problem to the general public, it is this that appalls them the most. Because the public quite rightly say, well, we rely on organisations like these to manage these kinds of technical problems for us. We don't expect to have to get involved in understanding what a systematic review and a meta-analysis is, about publication bias, about how things... Why do we have to get involved in understanding the FDA Amendment Act 2007? Surely this is somebody's job. Surely this is the job of all of these people. And I think people are rightly appalled that these organisations have let them down so badly. These documents have been under review on the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences Group website now since March. And it was a huge battle to get them to do even that. And they have made no attempt to clarify these entirely misleading statements. So, to understand the changes that have happened over access to trial results over the course of the past few years, I think it's best to start in 2007. You all know who Cochrane are, I'm sure. Cochrane is a non-profit international academic collaboration of 14,000 academics working now to produce gold standard systematic reviews and meta-analyses on pretty much all the questions there are about which treatment is best for all of the questions in medicine, whether it's surgical, whether it's medical, and so on. And in 2007, the Nordic Cochrane collaboration were doing a systematic review on orlistat and rimonabant, two weight loss drugs, and they had a brainwave. They said, well, look, it seems crazy that we rely always on published trial results when we know that the best currently available evidence shows that these are so commonly give a misleading or biased or exaggerated picture of the benefits of a treatment. But we know that regulators actually have more information. They may not necessarily have everything. They may not have all the trials done in Brazil, Russia, India, and China on unlicensed uses of the drugs, but we at least know that they have more than is in the public record. And so, why don't we ask them? So they wrote to the European Medicines Agency and said, we would like all of the information that you have on all of the trials on orlistat and rimonabant. European Medicines Agency said, no. People laugh when you show them this document, and I find that really interesting because it's a sort of intuitive laughter, because you think, I mean, it's so obviously bizarre that the European medicines regulator, who have patients' best interests at heart, when asked for trial results, would send that to Cochrane. And you almost wonder the person in the mailroom who sort of writes the Cochrane address on the envelope and then puts this in the envelope. Even they must be thinking, something's not right here. Something's gone wrong somewhere along the line. So this began a 3.5-year-long process of ultimately a formal complaint to the European Ombudsman, who in mid-2010 delivered probably the most damning finding of maladministration commentators say that they have seen against a body in Europe. It is an extraordinary torpedo to the European Medicines Agency. It says that they failed to make a consistent or coherent case about why they were withholding clinical study reports from Cochrane. And it says failed to make a coherent case because initially they were saying that these documents contained commercially confidential information. The European Ombudsman reviewed them and says this simply isn't true, and where it is true in small morsels, it's very, very straightforward to redact at very low cost. And secondly, then they changed their mind about a year and a half in and said that this contains commercial patient information, confidential patient information, at which point the Ombudsman said, well, this is occasionally true. And we know this is occasionally true, right? Occasionally you get two different types of information in clinical study reports that is patient confidential information. One is the individual line listings. Now, EMA don't really look at individual patient data, but you can get those in the standard ICH-GCP format. And I don't want those to be put in the public domain, to be absolutely clear. But in any case, they are in one appendix. They're very, very easy to redact. You just chop that out. Second category of individual patient information that is in CSRs is more interesting. It's sort of paragraph-long narratives describing adverse events. A 55-year-old man developed abnormal LFTs, cough, purulent sputum, that sort of stuff. Now, this, to me, is basically identical to the kind of stuff that you get in the raw text of a yellow card in a report to the MHRA of an adverse event outside of a trial. It's a narrative paragraph about a patient. It's a very straightforward thing, firstly, to redact that where it appears in a CSR, but it's also sometimes useful and important For example, the problems with paroxetine in children and teenagers, much of that was to be found in these adverse event reports. Some of the problems with Tamiflu were potentially to be found in these adverse event reports. So they need to be made available on request. And that is very straightforwardly handled for yellow card raw text, the ISAC board, which I'm sure some of you must have applied to. So ISAC handle access to GPRD data, now called CPRD, and they also handle access for yellow card raw text. Very straightforward thing. Just make an application, get that stuff. So, in any case, the European Ombudsman said, there's nothing that's commercially or patient confidential in this that can't be very, very straightforwardly removed before release. I command you to release this stuff. So in 2010, the European Medicines Agency were forced to open up. They were forced to produce a more liberal transparency policy. They were forced to start sharing clinical study reports. And so this began a very brief window in which people were able to get access to clinical study reports. Overall, the European Medicines Agency released about 1.9 million pages of documents. Now, this permitted some very interesting work to be done. Firstly, Tamiflu, I think, is probably the most celebrated case of people trying to get access to clinical study reports. Cochrane, in 2008, were asked by a UK and Australian government to update their review on Tamiflu because we were panicking about pandemics. And so they went and they did so, and they just updated it casually. And then, interestingly, this is a really good example, I think, of science working at its best. A Japanese pediatrician who read the Cochrane review posted a comment online, because Cochrane reviews make it really easy to just post a comment online and said, hey, look, I don't think you've done a very good job here, Cochrane, frankly, because the bulk of your data, in fact, 10 out of 12 trials in one review, you just secondarily cite this review article, where 10 of the 12 trials in this review article have never been published anywhere. All you've got is a bit of summary information about them in one table in this paper. And that's crap. You're supposed to be like doing Cochrane risk of bias scores or Haddad scores or whatever. You know, you're supposed to be critically appraising the methods of the trials that you are including in order to establish whether or not they are fair tests of the treatment. And instead of becoming defensive, Cochrane said, God, you're absolutely right. How embarrassing. We're going to go back and we're going to do it properly. Fantastic, really fantastic stuff. So they wrote to the author of this review article and said, look, we're in a sticky spot here. We took all this on faith, and some people do that, but we don't. We need more information about the trials. Lead author wrote back and said, look, I don't have it now. In fact, I don't think I ever had it. And most of that was done by Roche for me. And they go, blimey, that's interesting. Fair enough. So they go to Roche and they say, look, we need more information about these trials. This then begins a 4-year-long battle. It got to December 2009, and Cochrane felt that they just had to go ahead and publish without including these trials. So they published an extraordinary move, a systematic review for Cochrane on Tamiflu that says, look, we can't really give you an answer because Roche are refusing to give us the information that we need to make an informed judgment about these trials. December 2009, Roche promised to share all of the clinical study reports they have on Tamiflu with Cochrane. This then goes on for 4 years. 4 years of Cochrane's being asked by Roche to sign confidentiality agreements, all kinds of odd stories coming out from Roche about what bad people they are. Just very, very, very odd stuff, when really it should be a simple matter. Just tell us about the trials that you did. We'll have a look at them. And once the EMA made it more easy for them to get hold of clinical study reports, they were able to start piecing together a better picture of the trials that had been done and actually shed light on why it's so important that we do get clinical study reports. So I think it's important to recognize that there are really, I would say, 4 levels of information that we want about a clinical trial. Firstly, we want it to be registered. We want to know that it happened at all. Then secondly, we want a description of the results, the methods and results. Now this can be a filing on clinicaltrials.gov in structured tabular format. It can be an academic journal article of 3 pages or 10 pages or 20 pages. At the very top, the 4th level is individual patient data. Now that throws up all kinds of interesting problems around sharing, which we'll discuss in a moment. But in between these two is the clinical study report. Now the important thing about the clinical study report is we now know from comparing trials that were published in journals against what was written in the clinical study report, we now know that there can often be methodological shortcomings which are apparent in the clinical study report but which are glossed over in brief summaries to clinicaltrials.gov or in brief summaries in academic journal articles. For example, Cochrane have found trials where it's claimed that it's a double-blind trial, but in fact the pills were different colours, where it's claimed that Tamiflu is being compared against an inactive placebo, when in fact it contains dihydrocolloic acid, which promotes gallbladder emptying. Now, an active placebo is a legitimate thing to do sometimes. It might improve blinding, but that comes at a cost of obscuring your ability to detect gastro side effects, perhaps. So it doesn't matter that you've used an active placebo, but we have to know. So that's why it's important that we have access to clinical study reports, and that's not just something that we've seen with Tamiflu. It's also been demonstrated in a paper by Kay Dickerson looking at effectively clinical study reports released through a litigation process on a Pfizer drug. So that's why we need clinical study reports. So Cochrane were able to get from the EMA some clinical study reports, but not all, because it turns out, of course, that the EMA doesn't have them all. Firstly, EMA doesn't go back very far, and secondly, the EMA don't request all of the parts of all of the CSRs which they are given. So they don't have a complete picture, and therefore Cochrane could not get a complete picture. Now, secondly, interestingly, people get ants in their pants about the fact that it's not just Cochrane and academics requesting information from the European Medicines Agency. So out of the 1.9 million pages that have been released, many of those went to industry, people asking for CSRs for each other's drugs. And that is one of the reasons why this very brief window of greater transparency has now been shut down. Intermune and ABBV, and I think in the long run they will be shown to be on the wrong side of history, especially ABBV, as we'll see in a moment. Intermune and ABBV have taken the European Medicines Agency to the Central Court of Justice in the European Union and got an interim ruling to stop the European Medicines Agency from releasing clinical study reports. So these CSRs are now no longer available. This window has now closed. Probably the most extraordinary backward step, really, in the history of medicine around transparency, courtesy of these two companies. And their case was, well, we don't like the fact that the EMA share this stuff with competitors. Now, actually, I don't have a problem with things being shared with competitors. I have a problem with genuine confidential commercial information being shared with competitors. But information about the effectiveness of your drug and what was done in your trial is not commercially confidential information. You have to be proportionate. The European Ombudsman was very clear about that. The European Medicines Agency are very clear about that in their proposals. The rapporteur for the changes to the European legislation is very clear about that. And I think this is, they are going against the tide of history here. But also, I think it's important to recognize that in a very technical area, actually, it's often your competitors who are best positioned to spot flaws in what you've done. If you look at the Advertising Standards Agency, which is riddled with petty complaints, you'll find that the complaint about Bob's paint shop often comes from Sheila's paint shop around the corner, because Sheila knows the paint market better than any of us do. So she knows what Bob has said that is dodgy. And the same thing goes, I think, for regulation. So, foolish arguments made against transparency. Well, people say the problem doesn't exist, it's all in the past. This is, of course, what the AVPI has said to their, I think, eternal shame. Ben Goldacre seems fixated on issues with the pharmaceutical industry, which have long been addressed. And he sent some extraordinary emails, which I've chosen not to publicly disclose, which makes some extraordinary, the kind of smeary stuff which I think doesn't reflect very well on your industry and actually doesn't reflect the general tone and approach of the people who work in pharma. Because my friends work in pharma, right? They're not CEOs. They're people in their 30s and 40s who do everyday jobs like you. And, you're not idiots. You know that this isn't in the past. And you're able to have a serious conversation about it. He says it's long documented historical. They long address these issues. Trial results are published on websites such as clinicaltrials.gov. We know that this is entirely untrue. More serious people say, well, regulators see everything. A really interesting argument, because it assumes that regulators are superhuman. The reality is, regulators make mistakes. And that's not surprising. They are extremely well-motivated, highly educated, and highly capable. But they're not perfect. And actually, if we look at some of the biggest problems that have been spotted with medicines over the course of the past few years, problems with Vioxx, problems with rosiglitazone, the diabetes drug, Avandia, problems with the evidence base for Tamiflu, these problems weren't spotted primarily by regulators. They were spotted by independent doctors and researchers who often had to fight tooth and nail to get access to the information which they were then able to use to spot these problems and get action to prevent what were serious public health problems. So regulators aren't perfect. And actually, if we think about it, we're in the Royal College of Surgeons. The Royal Society just down the road is the oldest scientific body probably in the world. They have their motto above the door, nullius in verba, on the word of no one. Because in science, we don't accept what you say because you're an authority figure, because you're a prof, or you wear a white coat, or you've got a bunch of letters after your name. In science, we accept what you say because you tell us the full methods and results of what you've done, and we make our own informed judgment about the strengths and weaknesses of your case. That is the cultural norm throughout the whole of science. And it is absolutely remarkable that anybody should even begin to argue that we breach that cultural norm for medicine. Probably the most important applied science when it comes to life and death. Probably the most important applied science for the whole of humanity. Extraordinary that we would say, actually, it's okay for this information only to be seen behind closed doors, and all you get is a binary, yes, it works, no, it doesn't, brief summary kind of outcome. Extraordinary, really. Other arguments people make is they say it's too expensive to fix. Had the extraordinary spectacle, and this, as people who work in CROs, you will particularly appreciate, I think, people saying, going back and putting summaries of CSRs or redacted CSRs online for people to see, this is obviously impossible because it would be so expensive. Society has to decide whether we want to spend our money on researching new drugs or releasing these CSRs. Now, you work in CROs and in clinical research. You know the cost of doing one trial against the cost of redacting a clinical study report. They are an order of magnitude apart. That is an absurd argument, right? It costs, I would say, 10,000 times more to conduct and complete a clinical trial than it does to run through a clinical study report and take out some of the sections which have IPD in them. It's utterly ridiculous to compare the two. People say there's confidential commercial information in here, where the EU Ombudsman says that's not true, and where it is true, it's very easy to take it out. People say this will harm EU research. Well, nobody's asking for only the results of EU trials. We're asking for the results of all the trials conducted on all of the medicines and all of their uses that are currently being prescribed. And lastly, people say this is confidential patient information. Well, we've talked a little about the adverse event reports. I think individual patient data is an interesting issue. It's a very separate issue. There are practical issues around how you share it. So Yoda is one go at doing that. SAS, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, we're working with various different pharma companies to look at a kind of data sharing infrastructure where people can pool information but under escrow. And that's extremely important because actually some of the most important work to be done on individual patient data, for example, subgroup analyses, require that we pool information of different drugs in the same class from different manufacturers. So we can't accept a situation where you get access to somebody's individual patient data on their computer system in their office and you just run your code. We need to aggregate it. We need a system of escrow. And we need that to be flexible enough to allow other people to put their information in. It's coming anyway from the EMA in 2014. And it's not just doable, it is done. People sometimes talk about individual patient data sharing as if this was some sort of elaborate, extraordinary impossibility, but it happens all the time. It's been going on forever. It's been going on since the 70s and 80s. People have been doing individual patient data meta-analyses. This is probably the most influential, constantly updated, Early Breast Cancer Trialist Collaborative Group. They pull together all the information on breast cancer survival trials. And this is the author list. This is what science is really like, right? This is what most trials should probably look like, to be honest. So, has there been any progress? Well, from when the book came out in September of last year, first thing that happens is everybody goes, none of this is real. This is all in the past, says Stephen Whitehead of the ABPI. Still, I will carry to my grave my amazement at the brazenness of that statement. I mean, it defies belief, and it is a reputational torpedo at your industry. It is the least sensible thing I could imagine that he could possibly have done. But there you go, your decision. Sarah Wollaston MP, a week after the book came out, she used to be a GP, she got in touch, she said, look, I'm appalled by this problem of trial results being withheld, we have to raise this in Parliament, come in for a cup of tea. I said, great, let's do it. We went in, she tabled a question at Health Minister's Questions. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Earl Howe, the Minister with responsibility for the pharmaceutical industry, said, this problem doesn't exist till the Today programme. Trial results are already made available. By 11:30, when the question was formally asked in Parliament, after a series of please don't embarrass us emails, the formal answer that came was, yes, I do recognise that this is an important problem, and I'm very grateful to many members of the medical academic community, including Ben Goldacre, for raising it. I'd be happy to meet a group of them to discuss it. So that's what we did. That's what happens if I wear a suit. That's Ian Chalmers, founder of Cochrane, director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, Fee Godley from the BMJ. Because industry had become very smeary, we realised that we had to sort of show that this was a real problem. So this letter was done to the Times with me, Fee Godley, Richard Horton, President of the Royal College of GP, many people infinitely more eminent than me, to show that this matters and that we have to do something about it. Editorials in journals, more questions in Parliament. This is Prime Minister's questions. The Health Select Committee had stern words for NICE and industry, saying you've got to do something about this. Public Accounts Committee, written to by a group of influential MPs, they're about to do their report on Tamiflu. The Commons Select Committee said, we're going to look at this, and they've just produced their report, which says government has to do more about this. And we set up all trials. And all trials started in January. We ask for three things. We say all trials should be registered. We want summary results to be reported. That means either clinicaltrials.gov within 12 months or a published academic paper. You take your pick, but don't come crying to us and say, it's difficult to get things published in academic journals, because clinicaltrials.gov will take summary results of any trial for anyone, anywhere. There are no resource limitations, and anybody who fails to do that is harming patients. And then we ask for clinical study reports where they've been produced to also be made publicly available. This campaign is now supported by the great and good of medicine. I mean, there's just basically nobody who doesn't. Zero. Would you like me to stop, or would you like me to do 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Are you sure? Is that selfish? Okay, so now supported by, so the ones that people like are sort of Cochrane, MRC, PLOS, Wellcome, ICWIG, German equivalent of NICE. I think more important, actually, Health Research Authority, crucial. More important to me, actually, is over 150 patient groups representing well over 1 million patients. This is patients leading the professions, where the professions have signed documents like the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences group saying this problem doesn't exist. We see patient groups in their masses signing up and saying this problem does exist and you have to fix it, which I think is incredibly important. And actually, in some respects, quite moving, but, I'm not in a mushy mood. So Stephen Whitehead of the ABPI says we will not respond to PR-driven initiatives such as all trials. I think that's an extraordinary response, actually, to an organisation that represents, a campaign that represents 150 patient groups, really. And, the great and good, all the Royal Colleges, the Royal Society, it's an extraordinarily stupid thing to say. But there you go. He is your leader. That is your choice. And, of course, GSK. So GSK have signed up to the All Trials campaign. They previously committed to release, to share individual patient data on access through a committee for trials going back to 2007. They have further committed now to release, to register summary results and clinical study reports for all trials going back to the dawn of GSK, which is 2001. And that's extraordinary and a fantastic thing. They stand in stark contrast to ABBV. I spoke 3 weeks ago at the FPA meeting to launch and discuss their new transparency policy. And the representative from ABBV, as I'm sure some of you know, but if you don't know, I strongly recommend you go and watch the video of this meeting, which is on YouTube. Representative from ABBV tried to argue in an incredibly confused presentation that adverse event reports are commercially confidential information. Does anybody in this room agree with that? I won't pick on, no? It's an extraordinary thing to say, really. And the head of the MEB, the Dutch regulator, stood up and said, these were extraordinary scenes. Head of the Dutch regulator stood up and said, do you have any idea that you're working in healthcare? I think you should go and work in a different industry. It was an extraordinary episode. Hans-Georg Eichler, who I'm sure you will know, who's a very serious-looking man, stared from the floor. I have been working in regulation for over 2 decades, and I have never seen anything like this in all my days. An absolutely extraordinary episode. So what do we make of FPA's data sharing things? Well, they have 4 important holes. Firstly, they miss all off-label uses. They say we're going to share results, but they don't. They only promise it for licensed uses. And we know that people use drugs off-label, and of course they do in many cases. That is legitimate and reasonable. They say that you have to apply through independent panels, but those independent panels are not independent. Now, it may be difficult to get independent people to go on your independent panels, but you just don't call them independent panels, would be my view. I ask merely for clear labelling and good filing. It says even protocols should only be available after a request through these independent panels. Now, that's so bonkers that it seems to me that it was written by somebody who actually hasn't really thought this through. I don't think anybody really thinks that protocols require the same level of protection as individual patient data sets with hundreds of variables on each participant. But most crucially, it misses all previous trials. So it's entirely prospective. This is a problem, of course, with the EMA thing as well. FPA's launch of this was slightly undermined by a leaked email which showed that they had written, this was written to sort of the leads of all of the big pharma companies in the world, FPA and pharma, saying that under the heading advocacy strategies, number one was mobilizing patient groups to raise concerns about the public health risks of more transparency around clinical trials. Which is an extraordinary and rather worrying thing for them to have written. Here we go. It includes a plan to use patient groups to support campaign against greater access to trial data in PM Live. Memo from the European Pharma Lobby revealed that industry is trying to mobilize patient groups to help stop new rules on releasing trial data. This is right back to the 80s. This is the stuff which we are routinely promised by Stephen Whitehead, your leader, you chose him. But this is the sort of stuff which people are routinely trying to tell us doesn't happen anymore, and yet mobilizing patient groups to campaign against transparency regulators. It's extraordinary and it's unnecessary. I think there is an inevitable policy trajectory towards greater transparency, and fighting against it will only bring shame and humiliation on your industry, which reflects badly on doctors. It's a bad thing, right? I don't take any pleasure in industry behaving badly, because I need public trust in medicines, but I'm not going to lie to patients and pretend that everything is okay in order to elicit that public trust. We need to talk about these problems, we need to fix them, and I genuinely wish that industry would not say things like, none of this exists. I think it's very, very dangerous for the reputation of the people in this room, and I know that you do not. Does anybody agree with Stephen Whitehead that this is all in the past, that these issues are not current? It's very, very strange and very embarrassing for you, but he's your leader. What else has happened? Well, the BMA just passed a thing saying that non-publication of trial results is research misconduct. I think this is incredibly important. This was passed as a formal motion at their AGM, so this now goes into BMA policy. They're talking about referring people to have their fitness to practice assessed if they are party to withholding trial results. The Health Research Authority, fantastically, have said that they're going to make trial registration a condition of ethics committee approval. They're setting new standards for dissemination. They're going to audit compliance with this, which is incredibly important. Open, transparent, routine public audit to make sure that people do what they say they do. And it's an extraordinary thing, actually, just after a year of campaigning on this stuff, to find yourself, after you've criticised organisations, then being on their press release, as I was with this one, saying how fantastic they are for doing the right thing. It is possible for people to turn around, and there is no reputational cost of going, we're going to do the right thing, we're going to do better. It's a really easy thing to do. Changes in Europe, we work very closely with Glenis Wilmot, and some of the changes at the European Parliament to the clinical trials regulation are looking very good, but the problem is it's now gone to basically be dealt with in private. Do you know about tripartite discussions? They're too long and boring to discuss, but basically it means it all happens behind closed doors. Europe is actually weirdly quite transparent until it goes that way, and then all is lost. European Medicines Agency have obviously got their plans, which I think you are going to talk about and perhaps say some unkind things about. But I think the biggest flaw with what they are doing is that they are not promising to release information retrospectively. The good thing that they're doing is that they are releasing information prospectively. The thing that industry don't like about this is they say, oh, people are going to misuse it, they're going to cherry pick, they're going to go on fishing trips. Industry, it's extraordinary, at the launch of their review for this, I was on a panel next to two people from FPA, and the people from FPA kept saying, well, the problem is, if people don't publish their statistical analysis plans before they work on a data set, then we don't know if they've gone on a sort of fishing expedition. And I absolutely agree. I fully agree. And that's why I think both industry and second parties working on industry's own data should share their statistical analysis plans publicly before they do their analyses. I don't see why we should ask people reusing industry data to hold them to any higher standards than we hold industry. So then finally, Test Act. And then lastly, interesting sort of mischievous corner, or potentially actually very important, the Riot program. This is a really interesting thing. Basically, we know that doctors use academic journal articles. We know that they don't read clinical study reports. And so where there are clinical study reports of trials that have never been published, or of trials that where only misleading and biased analyses have been published, what do? Well, the answer is we get the clinical study report and we turn that into a paper. And this produces interesting paradoxes. This has been done once so far on an EPO trial, where somebody managed to get the individual patient data, and this was a trial which had been very badly reported, very badly analysed. They'd done all kinds of shifty tricks. So he did a proper analysis, published it. It was Coyne et al. He published it and he said, look, I'm in the very odd position now where I had nothing to do with this trial, but I'm the only person to have faithfully reported an intention to treat analysis of its primary outcomes. And therefore, my paper describing this trial is now canonical. This is the correct paper for this trial. And that, I hope, will happen more and more. So, sorry to go on. What should you do? Well, I think the most important thing is you have to take ownership of this problem, not sole ownership, but you are important ethical professionals working in an important industry that has an impact on patient care. Where you see people saying, this problem, these issues are in the past, you should say, that is not true. Where you see the opportunity to campaign for greater transparency, I think you should take it. I think you should show leadership in addressing it. I think you should lobby for better guidelines. You should sign all trials.net. I think if people genuinely have an argument against releasing summary results from clinical trials, they should come out and say so. At the moment, all anybody wants to talk about publicly is individual patient data. I suspect because that's the one where it is possible to say, oh, well, it's a bit complicated. Well, it is a bit complicated. But does that mean that we all accept that summary results for all the trials of all the uses of all the medicines currently being prescribed must be made available to doctors and researchers so that collectively they can make informed decisions about which treatment is best? I hope that you would agree, and because of that, I would hope that you would sign alltrials.net. Thank you very much.